Her fate in the hands of a Don. Caterina Romano had been promised to a man she had never met, a marriage arranged for power, not love. But before she could walk down the aisle, she was taken stolen in the night by a man who had no right to touch her. Enzo Vitali smirked as he leaned against the door, watching her like she was a prize he had already won. "You were never meant to be his," he murmured, brushing a knuckle along her jaw. "And I don't plan to give you back." Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bride's Predicament. The silk felt cold against Caterina Romano's skin, a stark contrast to the sweltering July heat that pressed against the villa's ancient stone walls. It was a beautiful dress, ivory and cascading, embroidered with delicate pearls that shimmered in the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows. A dress fit for a queen, or, in Caterina's case, a pawn in a meticulously crafted game of power. She stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The makeup artist had done a masterful job, highlighting her cheekbones, darkening her already expressive brown eyes, and painting her lips a soft, inviting rose. But beneath the expertly applied artistry, Caterina felt like a stranger in her own life. A soft knock on the door pulled her from the unsettling reflection.
Caterina, cara?
Her mother's voice, usually so strong and commanding, held a tremor of what? Sadness? Resignation? "Come in, Mama," Caterina replied, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. Isabella Romano entered, her own elegant dress, a deep emerald green, rustling softly with each step. Isabella was a formidable woman, the matriarch of the Romano family, a woman who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. She had navigated the treacherous waters of their world with a steely resolve, ensuring the family's survival and prosperity. But today, even her armor seemed to have a chink. Isabella reached out, her hand, adorned with a large emerald ring that had belonged to Caterina's grandmother, gently cupping Caterina's cheek. "You are beautiful, my daughter. Truly beautiful." Caterina managed a weak smile. "It's the dress, Mama. It hides the fear." Isabella's eyes softened. "There is no shame in fear, Caterina. Especially on a day like this." "A day I never wanted," Caterina whispered, her gaze drifting back to the window, to the sprawling gardens beyond, where the preparations for the wedding were in full swing. Caterers bustled about, arranging tables laden with flowers and crystal. Guests, some familiar, some strangers, all players in this intricate dance of alliances were beginning to arrive, their voices a low murmur carried on the warm breeze. The man she was to marry, Alessandro Moretti, was the head of the Moretti family, a powerful clan whose influence stretched across the southern coast of Italy. The union was strategic, a merging of two powerful families, a solidifying of territories and resources. Love, Caterina knew, had nothing to do with it. She had never even met the man. All she knew were the carefully curated stories her father and brothers had shared, tales of Alessandro's ruthlessness, his ambition, his unwavering loyalty to his family. Traits, Caterina suspected, that were valued far more than kindness or compassion in their world. "He is a good man, Caterina," Isabella said, as if reading her daughter's thoughts. "Strong. Respected. He will provide for you, protect you." "Protect me from what, Mama? From the world you and Papa created? From the enemies we have accumulated like trophies?" Caterina's voice was laced with a bitterness she could no longer suppress. Isabella sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "We do what we must, Caterina. For the family. For our legacy. And what about what I want?" Caterina turned back to her mother, her eyes blazing. "Does that ever matter?" Isabella's gaze fell. "It matters, Cara. Of course it matters. But sometimes we must make sacrifices for the greater good." "The greater good," Caterina repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The family. Always the family." She turned away, unable to bear the pity in her mother's eyes. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Caterina felt like a caged bird, fluttering against the bars of her gilded prison. She watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it only served to amplify the hollowness in her chest. Later, as darkness began to creep in, her brother, Marco, entered the room. He was the eldest, the heir apparent, a man who carried the weight of the family's expectations on his broad shoulders. He was a hardened man, a reflection of their father. Yet Katerina had always seen a flicker of something softer in his eyes, a hint of the boy he once was, before the world had molded him into the man he had become. "Katerina," he said softly, his voice devoid of its usual commanding tone. He approached her cautiously, as if she were a wounded animal. "Marco," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back. He was tall, like all the Romano men, with dark hair and eyes that mirrored her own. "Are you ready?" Katerina almost laughed. Ready? Was she ready to be handed over to a stranger, to become a piece in a game she didn't want to play? "No," she said, her voice trembling. "But it doesn't matter, does it?" Marco's jaw tightened. He looked away, out the window, to the lights that now twinkled in the gardens below. "It matters," he said, his voice low. "It matters to me." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something Katerina couldn't quite decipher. I wish things were different, Katerina. I wish you didn't have to do this." "But you'll still let it happen," Katerina said, the words laced with a quiet accusation. Marco didn't answer. He simply reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle. "I will always protect you, Katerina. Always. Even from this." His words, meant to be comforting, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a promise, a vow, spoken with the weight of the Romano family behind it. But it was also a warning, a reminder that she was trapped, that her life was not her own. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hallway. Marco squeezed her hand one last time, then stepped back, his face hardening once more. The door opened, and their father, Don Antonio Romano, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was a formidable figure, even in his aging years, his presence commanding respect and fear in equal measure. "It is time," he said, his voice gravelly, his gaze sweeping over Katerina, assessing her, approving of the image she presented. The perfect bride. The perfect sacrifice. Katerina took a deep breath, steeling herself. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's gaze with a newfound defiance. She might be a pawn, but she would not be a broken one. She would face this, as she faced everything in her life, with courage, with resilience, and with a quiet determination to survive. But as she walked towards the door, a single tear traced a path down her perfectly made-up cheek, a silent testament to the life she was leaving behind, the freedom she had lost. The faint scent of jasmine, her favorite flower, wafted in from the garden, a cruel reminder of simpler times, of a life she could only dream of now. And, in the distance, she could hear a low, guttural growl, like a wild animal, prowling just beyond the edges of the beautifully lit celebration. Chapter 2. A shadow falls over the city. The city of Naples hummed with a nervous energy, a palpable tension that hung heavy in the humid night air. It wasn't just the impending wedding of Caterina Romano and Alessandro Moretti that had the city on edge, though that event alone was enough to send ripples through the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define the Neapolitan underworld. There were whispers, rumors of something else, something darker brewing beneath the surface. Detective Isabella Rossi felt it in her bones. She leaned against the railing of her small balcony, overlooking the sprawling city, the lights twinkling like a fallen constellation. The scent of salt and exhaust mingled with the sweet aroma of jasmine from a nearby garden, a strangely comforting combination in the face of the unease she felt. Isabella was a veteran of the Naples police force, a woman who had seen the best and worst of the city. She had a reputation for being tough, incorruptible, and fiercely dedicated to her work. She had also learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her. The Romano-Moretti wedding was a powder keg, a potential flashpoint for violence. The two families, while ostensibly allies, had a history of bad blood, a legacy of betrayals and power struggles that stretched back generations. Isabella had spent the last few weeks trying to convince her superiors to increase security, to be prepared for any eventuality, but her pleas had fallen on deaf ears. The higher-ups, many of whom were rumored to be in the pockets of the very families they were supposed to be policing, were more concerned with maintaining the facade of peace than with preventing a potential bloodbath. Isabella? A voice from behind startled her. She turned to see her partner, Marco Leone, standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on his face. Marco was younger than Isabella, but he was a good cop, loyal and dedicated. He was also one of the few people Isabella trusted implicitly. "You're still up," Marco said, stepping onto the balcony and joining her at the railing. "Couldn't sleep," Isabella replied, her gaze returning to the city below. "Something feels off, Marco." "I can't shake it." Marco nodded, his gaze following hers. "The wedding," he said, stating the obvious.
More than that, Isabella said.
"There's something else going on. I've been hearing rumors." "Rumors about what?" Isabella hesitated. She hadn't wanted to voice her suspicions, even to Marco, until she had something more concrete. But the knot in her stomach was tightening with each passing hour.
Rumors about Vitali.
The name hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the danger it represented. Enzo Vitali, the head of the Vitali family, a rival clan that had been locked in a bitter feud with the Romanos and Morettis for decades. He was a ghost, a phantom, rarely seen in public, but his presence was felt everywhere. He was known for his ruthlessness, his cunning, and his unwavering hatred for both families. "What about Vitali?" Marco asked, his voice low. "I've heard he's back in the city," Isabella said. "After years of being elsewhere." "Back?" Marco's eyebrows shot up. "Why now? What's he planning?" Isabella shook her head. "I don't know. But it can't be good. Not with the wedding happening." The thought of Enzo Vitali, a man shrouded in darkness and violence, being in Naples on the eve of the Romano Moretti wedding sent a chill down Isabella's spine. It was like a predator circling its prey, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. They stood in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the distant hum of the city and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, cast long shadows across the rooftops, making the city look even more menacing. "We need to be careful, Marco," Isabella said, finally breaking the silence. "Very careful. This could be bigger than anything we've ever dealt with." "I know," Marco replied, his hand instinctively moving to the gun holstered at his hip. "I've got your back, Isabella. Always." Isabella nodded, grateful for his unwavering loyalty. She knew she could count on him, no matter what. But as she looked out at the city, at the darkness that seemed to be closing in, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm that could very well consume them all. The air thickened. The distant sounds of celebration from the Romano villa seemed muffled, distant, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Even the usually vibrant street vendors, normally hawking their wares late into the night, had packed up early, their faces etched with a worry that mirrored Isabella's own. The silence was broken only by the occasional screech of a seagull, a sound that, tonight, felt more like a warning cry. Chapter 3. The uninvited guest's arrival. The music swelled, a lively tarantella that filled the Romano villa's grand ballroom. Guests, dressed in their finest attire, twirled and laughed, their faces flushed with wine and excitement. Caterina, standing beside her father, forced a smile, playing the part of the radiant bride-to-be. But beneath the surface, her heart was a leaden weight in her chest. She felt like a puppet, her strings being pulled by the powerful hands of her family, her every move dictated by tradition and duty. Alessandro Moretti, her betrothed, had finally arrived. He was a handsome man, in a dark, brooding way. Tall and lean, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with a cold calculation. He had greeted her with a polite bow and a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, his touch sending a shiver of unease down her spine. He spoke little, his words formal and measured, his gaze constantly scanning the room, as if searching for threats. Katerina had tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were clipped and evasive. It was clear that he was not interested in getting to know her, in forging any kind of connection. He saw her, Katerina realized, as a possession, a symbol of the alliance between their families, nothing more. Don Antonio Romano, ever the gracious host, circulated among the guests, his presence commanding respect and deference. He clapped Alessandro on the back, his laughter booming through the ballroom, a display of unity and strength for all to see. But Katerina noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around the room, ever watchful, ever wary. He, too, felt the unease that hung in the air. As the evening progressed, Katerina found herself increasingly isolated. Her bridesmaids, cousins, and childhood friends were caught up in the festivities, their attention focused on the handsome young men in attendance. She felt a pang of longing for their carefree joy, a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. She excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air, and slipped out onto the terrace. The night air was warm and humid, heavy with the scent of jasmine and sea salt. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast a silvery glow over the gardens, illuminating the paths and fountains below. Katerina leaned against the balustrade, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the periphery of her vision. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, and found herself face to face with a man she had never seen before. He was tall, taller even than Alessandro, with a presence that filled the space around him. He was dressed in black, his clothes blending seamlessly with the shadows, but the moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his dark eyes. He had a raw, untamed energy about him, a dangerous allure that both frightened and intrigued her.
Who are you?
Katerina asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, his gaze unwavering, his eyes burning into hers. It was a look that stripped her bare, that saw past the facade of the dutiful daughter, the reluctant bride. It was a look that made her feel seen. "You are Katerina Romano," he said finally, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Katerina nodded, unable to speak. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. She could smell his scent, a mix of leather, smoke, and something else, something wild and untamed. "I am Enzo Vitali," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The name hit her like a physical blow. Enzo Vitali. The enemy. The man her family had warned her about, the man who represented everything they stood against. She should have been terrified, should have screamed for help. But she found herself strangely frozen, captivated by his presence, by the intensity of his gaze. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are even more beautiful than they said." Katerina's breath caught in her throat. She should pull away, should slap his hand away, but she couldn't. She was mesmerized, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. "What would he want?" She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. A slow smile curved his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I came to see the bride," he said. "The bride who was promised to another." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "But you were never meant to be his, Katerina. You were always meant to be mine." His words, spoken with such certainty, such possessiveness, sent a wave of both fear and excitement through her. She knew she should run, should alert the guards, should do anything but stand there, captivated by this dangerous man. But she couldn't. She was trapped, caught in his web, and a part of her, a part she had long suppressed, didn't want to escape. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a dangerous electricity that seemed to bind them together. The sounds of the party faded into the background, the world shrinking to just the two of them, standing on the terrace, bathed in moonlight, on the precipice of something forbidden and potentially catastrophic. The distant rumble of thunder, a promise of an approaching storm, seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing within Katerina's own heart. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Darkened Room. The room was a stark contrast to the opulent ballroom Katerina had left behind. It was small, sparsely furnished, with a single window that overlooked a dark, deserted alleyway. The only light came from a flickering candle on a small table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, a musty smell that spoke of secrets and forgotten things. Enzo Vitali had led her there swiftly, silently, his hand firmly gripping her arm. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the terrace, his silence more intimidating than any threat. Katerina had stumbled along beside him, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea where he was taking her, what he planned to do with her, but she knew she was in grave danger. He released her arm once they were inside, closing and locking the door behind them. He then turned to face her, his eyes, dark and unreadable in the dim light, studying her intently.
Why?
Katerina finally asked, her voice trembling. Why did you bring me here? Enzo didn't answer immediately. He moved to the table, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He picked up a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, pouring a generous amount into each. He offered one to Katerina. She shook her head, refusing. She wouldn't drink with him, wouldn't share anything with this man who had stolen her from her own wedding. He shrugged, seemingly unfazed by her refusal, and took a long sip from his own glass. You ask why, he said, his voice low and husky. I told you. You were never meant to be his. I don't belong to you, Katerina retorted, her voice gaining a bit of strength. I belong to no one. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Brave words, Katerina. But we both know that's not true. You belong to your family. To the Romanos. And now, by extension, to the Morettis. And you think you can change that? Katerina challenged, her eyes flashing. By kidnapping me? By holding me against my will? He set down his glass, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. He took a step closer, his presence dominating the small space. Kidnapping? He repeated, a hint of mockery in his voice. Is that what you think this is? What else would you call it? Katerina demanded. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the wine on his breath. I call it redemption, he whispered. A chance to right a wrong. To take back what was stolen. Katerina frowned, confused. What are you talking about? He straightened, his expression turning serious. Your family, Katerina, the Romanos, they have a long history. A history of betrayal, of violence, of taking what doesn't belong to them. Lies, Katerina spat. You're just trying to justify your actions. He shook his head.
No, Katerina.
I'm telling you the truth. A truth your family has kept hidden from you. A truth about my family, the Vitalis, and about you. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. Years ago, Katerina, our families were not enemies. We were allies. Partners. My father and your grandfather, they were like brothers. They built an empire together. Katerina listened, her skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. She had always been told that the Vitalis were their sworn enemies, that the feud between their families was ancient and irreconcilable. But Enzo's words, spoken with such conviction, planted a seed of doubt in her mind. And then, Katerina prompted, her voice barely a whisper. And then your grandfather betrayed my father, Enzo said, his voice filled with a bitterness that seemed to come from deep within. He stole everything. Our businesses, our territory, our future. He took another sip of wine, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. My father was ruined. He lost everything. He died a broken man. And I vowed to avenge him, to take back what was rightfully ours. And that includes me? Katerina asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. You are not a possession, Katerina. You are a symbol of what your family took from mine. And by taking you, I am reclaiming what is rightfully ours. His words resonated with a certain pain that reached in and touched a place of empathy, long kept locked away. The code, the honor, even in revenge. It was a language she understood, even if she didn't want to. But I had nothing to do with that, Katerina said, her voice pleading. I wasn't even born when all of this happened. No, Enzo agreed. You are innocent, but you are also a Romano. And that, in this world, is enough. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. But I don't want to hurt you, Katerina. I don't want to punish you for the sins of your family. I want something else. He moved back to his old spot, and the shadows, the silence moved with him. Katerina, a pawn, yet perhaps not just a pawn. His eyes locked on hers, the question hanging in the air, heavy and charged. The candle flickered. A single, solitary sound outside in the alley echoed, and Katerina felt a mix of fear and an odd anticipation, a dangerous curiosity that it might be possible she too could choose. Chapter 5. Flight into the unknown night. The escape was a blur, a chaotic sequence of hurried movements and hushed whispers. Enzo, his hand firmly clasped around Katerina's, guided her through the labyrinthine alleyways of Naples, his knowledge of the city's hidden passages and secret routes evident in every turn. The night air was thick with humidity and the threat of rain, the distant rumble of thunder a constant reminder of the storm that was brewing, both literally and figuratively. Katerina stumbled along beside him, her silk dress snagging on rough brick walls, her delicate shoes ill-suited for the uneven cobblestones. She was breathless, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had no idea where they were going, what Enzo's plan was, but she knew she had to trust him. It was a leap of faith, a desperate gamble, but she had made her choice. She had chosen to flee with the enemy, to abandon the life she had always known, to step into the unknown. Where are we going? Katerina whispered, her voice breathless. Somewhere safe, Enzo replied, his voice low and reassuring. Somewhere they won't find you. They'll be looking for us, Katerina said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. My family, Alessandro, they won't give up. Enzo's grip on her hand tightened. Let them look, he said, his voice hardening. They won't find us. They moved swiftly, silently, like shadows in the night. They avoided the main thoroughfares, sticking to the narrow, winding streets and back alleys, where the darkness provided cover. The city, usually so vibrant and alive, felt menacing tonight, the shadows seeming to watch them, the silence punctuated by the occasional screech of a cat or the distant wail of a siren. Katerina's mind raced, trying to make sense of the events of the past few hours. She had gone from being a reluctant bride, trapped in a gilded cage, to a fugitive, running for her life with the man who was supposed to be her enemy. It was surreal, unbelievable, yet it was happening. She was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, fear, confusion, and a strange, unsettling excitement. She stole glances at Enzo, studying his profile in the dim light. He was a mystery to her, a man shrouded in darkness and violence, yet she had seen a glimpse of something else in his eyes, a vulnerability, a pain that resonated with her own. She had heard the conviction in his voice when he spoke of his family, of the betrayal they had suffered. She had seen the flicker of something akin to care in his gaze when he looked at her. It was this glimpse of something beyond the ruthless facade that had compelled her to trust him, to take this leap of faith. It was a dangerous gamble, she knew, but she had nothing left to lose. Her life, as she had known it, was over. She had to embrace this new, uncertain future, even if it terrified her. They finally reached their destination, a nondescript building in a quiet, residential neighborhood. It looked like any other building on the street, its facade unremarkable, its windows dark and uninviting. Enzo produced a key, unlocking the door and ushering Katerina inside. The interior was just as unassuming as the exterior. A small, sparsely furnished apartment, clean but devoid of any personal touches. It was clearly a safe house, a place used for temporary refuge, a place where secrets were kept. Enzo closed and locked the door behind them, then turned to Katerina, his eyes searching hers. Are you all right? he asked, his voice softer now, his concern evident. Katerina nodded, her voice still caught in her throat. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she was also relieved. She had made it. She was safe for now. Enzo gestured towards a small sofa.
Sit, he said.
You must be tired. Katerina sank onto the sofa, her legs trembling. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Enzo disappeared into another room, returning a few moments later with a glass of water and a blanket. He handed her the water, then draped the blanket around her shoulders. Thank you, Katerina whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. He sat down in a chair opposite the sofa, his eyes never leaving her face. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the gentle hum of the city outside. The storm had finally broken, the rain now drumming against the windows, a steady rhythm that was both soothing and unsettling. Katerina looked at Enzo, at the man who had turned her life upside down, at the man who was both her captor and her savior. She had so many questions, so many doubts, but she also felt a strange sense of peace. She was here, in this unknown place, with this unknown man, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. It was a fragile freedom, a dangerous freedom, but it was hers. And she would cling to it, no matter what the future held. The rain intensified, washing away the remnants of the night, the echoes of the life she had left behind. And in the silence of the small apartment, Katerina felt the first stirrings of something new, something unknown, something that might just be hope. Chapter 6. The Safe House of Secrets. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. The safe house, while providing refuge from the immediate danger, felt like another kind of prison. Katerina was confined to the small apartment, her only contact with the outside world being Enzo. He was a constant presence, a silent guardian, his eyes always watching her, assessing her, his motives still a mystery. He provided for her needs, bringing food and supplies, ensuring she was comfortable, but he offered little in the way of conversation. He was a man of few words, his silence more revealing than any elaborate explanation. Katerina spent her days pacing the small rooms, staring out the window at the street below, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She was trapped between two worlds, the life she had left behind and the uncertain future that lay ahead. She thought of her family, of her mother's tear-stained face, of her brother's promise to protect her. She wondered if they were searching for her, if they were worried, if they blamed her for what had happened. She imagined the fury of Alessandro Moretti, the humiliation he must be feeling, the damage to his pride. She knew that her disappearance had ignited a war, a conflict that could have devastating consequences. She also thought of Enzo, of the man who had stolen her away, of the secrets he held, of the strange connection she felt to him. She replayed their conversation in the darkened room, his words about his family's betrayal, about his vow for revenge. She tried to reconcile the image of the ruthless mafia boss with the man who brought her food, who offered her a blanket, who looked at her with a mixture of intensity and something else, something she couldn't quite define. One afternoon, as Katerina was staring out the window, lost in thought, Enzo entered the room, carrying a small package. He placed it on the table, his eyes meeting hers. "What's this?" Katerina asked, her curiosity piqued. "Something for you," Enzo replied, his voice neutral. Katerina approached the table cautiously, her heart beating faster. She unwrapped the package, revealing a simple cotton dress, a pair of comfortable sandals, and a book. The dress was a pale blue, a color that reminded her of the sky on a clear summer day. The sandals were plain, but practical. The book was a collection of Italian poetry, a volume she had once mentioned wanting to read. Katerina looked up at Enzo, surprised.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice soft. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "You needed clothes," he said, "and something to occupy your time." "But the book," Katerina said, her fingers tracing the cover of the volume. "How did you know?" A flicker of something akin to embarrassment crossed his face. "I remember you mentioning it," he said, his voice gruff. At the villa, Katerina was touched by his gesture, by the unexpected thoughtfulness. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. It was a reminder that he saw her, that he listened to her, that he cared, even if he couldn't express it in words. "Thank you," Katerina said, her voice sincere. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. He then turned and walked towards the window, staring out at the street below. Katerina changed into the new clothes, feeling a sense of relief as she shed the remnants of her former life. The cotton dress was soft and comfortable, a welcome change from the heavy silk of her wedding gown. The sandals fit perfectly. She opened the book of poetry, her fingers tracing the words, the verses evoking a sense of longing and nostalgia. She sat on the sofa, reading, losing herself in the beauty of the language, the emotions conveyed in each line. She was still a prisoner in a way, but she felt a sense of peace. She was safe for now, and she had something to occupy her mind, to distract her from the uncertainty of her situation. As the days passed, a fragile trust began to develop between Katerina and Enzo. They started to talk, cautiously at first, sharing snippets of their lives, their pasts. Enzo remained guarded, revealing little about his current activities, about his plans for the future, but he spoke more openly about his childhood, about his father, about the pain of his family's betrayal. Katerina, in turn, shared her own experiences, her frustrations with the constraints of her life, her longing for freedom, her dreams of a different future. She found herself confiding in him, sharing things she had never shared with anyone else. The safe house, once a symbol of confinement, began to feel different. It was still a prison, in a sense, but it was also a sanctuary, a place where two unlikely souls, bound by circumstance, were forging a connection, a bond that defied the boundaries of their warring families. The air, once thick with tension and suspicion, began to clear, replaced by a fragile sense of understanding. The shared meals, simple but prepared by Enzo with a surprising care, became moments of quiet connection, a silent acknowledgement of their shared predicament. The evenings, once filled with anxious silence, were now punctuated by hesitant conversation, by the sharing of stories, by the slow unveiling of two wounded souls. Chapter 7. Unveiling a Hidden Past. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting a pale light over the city. Katerina and Enzo sat on the small balcony of the safe house, a shared silence between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but rather a companionable one, a quiet understanding that had grown between them over the past few days. Enzo broke the silence, his voice low and hesitant. I want to show you something," he said. Katerina looked at him, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then stood up. "Come with me." He led her back inside, through the small living room and into a smaller room that served as a makeshift office. It was cluttered with papers, maps, and a single, old-fashioned desk. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old ink. Enzo went to the desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a worn leather-bound box. He placed it on the desk, his eyes meeting Katerina's. This belonged to my father," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of reverence and pain. "It contains documents, letters, proof of what your family did." Katerina's heart pounded in her chest. She had heard Enzo's accusations, his claims of betrayal, but she had always dismissed them as the ravings of a vengeful man. But now, faced with this box, with the weight of his father's legacy, she couldn't ignore the possibility that there was truth to his words. Enzo opened the box, his hands trembling slightly. He carefully removed the contents, spreading them out on the desk. There were letters, handwritten in elegant script, contracts, meticulously detailed, and photographs, faded with age. "These letters," Enzo said, pointing to a stack of correspondence, "are between my father and your grandfather. They detail their business dealings, their partnership, their plans for the future." Katerina leaned closer, her eyes scanning the letters. She recognized her grandfather's handwriting, the familiar loops and swirls. She read snippets of the text, words of friendship, of trust, of shared ambition. And these, Enzo continued, pointing to the contracts, are the agreements they signed. Agreements that your grandfather later violated. Agreements that stripped my family of everything. The contracts were complex, filled with legal jargon, but Katerina could see the signatures at the bottom, her grandfather's bold and confident, her great-uncle's elegant and precise. Enzo's father's signature was there as well, smaller, less assertive. And these photographs, Enzo said, his voice barely a whisper, show them together.
Friends.
Partners. Brothers almost. The photographs were the most poignant. They showed two men, younger versions of her grandfather and Enzo's father, smiling, laughing, their arms around each other's shoulders. They looked happy, carefree, their bond seemingly unbreakable. Katerina felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had always been told that the Vitales were their enemies, that the feud between their families was ancient and irreconcilable. But these documents, these photographs, told a different story. They told a story of friendship, of partnership, of betrayal. I don't understand, Katerina said, her voice trembling. Why would my grandfather do this? Why would he betray his friend? Enzo's face hardened. Greed, he said, his voice laced with bitterness.
Power.
Your grandfather wanted it all. He saw an opportunity to take everything, and he took it. But why didn't anyone ever tell me? Katerina asked, her voice filled with confusion and pain. Why was this kept a secret? Enzo sighed. Your family, they have a way of rewriting history, he said. Of burying the truth. Of protecting their image, their legacy, at any cost. Katerina felt a sense of betrayal, a deep wound inflicted by her own family. She had been lied to, manipulated, kept in the dark about a crucial part of her own history. She had been raised to hate the Vitales, to fear them, when in reality, they were the victims. She looked at Enzo, at the pain in his eyes, at the weight of his family's legacy that he carried on his shoulders. She saw a man who had been robbed of his birthright, a man who had been forced to live in the shadows, a man who was driven by a desire for justice, for revenge. And she understood. She understood his anger, his bitterness, his determination to take back what was rightfully his. She also understood the risk he had taken in showing her these documents, in revealing the truth. He had trusted her, a Romano, with his family's secrets, with his own vulnerability. I believe you, Katerina said, her voice firm. I believe what you're telling me. Enzo looked at her, surprised. He had expected resistance, denial, anger. But he saw only understanding, empathy, and a shared sense of betrayal. A flicker of something akin to hope crossed his face. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers. Thank you, Katerina, he said, his voice soft. For believing me. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a spark of connection that transcended their warring families, their conflicting loyalties. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, by the evidence of a long-buried betrayal, Katerina felt a shift in her own heart. She was no longer just a Romano, a pawn in a game of power. She was something more. She was a woman who had seen the truth, a woman who had chosen to believe, a woman who was beginning to understand the complexities of love, loyalty, and revenge. The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of the past lifting slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of possibility. A shared understanding, a silent vow, passed between them, a promise of a future that, while uncertain, was now undeniably intertwined. Chapter 8. The Weight of Family Expectations. Back in the opulent Romano villa, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The grand ballroom, once filled with music and laughter, was now silent and empty, the remnants of the abandoned wedding a stark reminder of the chaos that had erupted. Don Antonio Romano paced the length of the room, his face a mask of fury, his hands clenched into fists. His sons, Marco and Luca, stood before him, their expressions a mixture of anger and concern. Find her, Don Antonio roared, his voice echoing through the empty space. Find Katerina and bring her back. And when you find Vitali, kill him. Marco, the elder son, remained stoic, his face betraying little emotion. We're doing everything we can, Papa, he said, his voice calm and measured. We have men searching the city. We've alerted our contacts. We'll find her. Luca, the younger, more impulsive brother, was less composed. That bastard Vitali.
He spat.
He'll pay for this. He'll regret the day he ever crossed us. Isabella Romano, standing near the window, her face pale and drawn, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of dread and despair. She had tried to reason with her husband, to plead for a less violent approach, but her words had fallen on deaf ears. He was consumed by rage, by the humiliation of Caterina's abduction, by the threat to their family's honor. Antonio, Isabella said softly, her voice trembling.
Please.
This is not the way. Violence will only beget more violence. Don Antonio turned on her, his eyes blazing. Silence, woman. He thundered. This is a matter of family honor. Vitali has declared war, and we will respond in kind. Isabella flinched at his words, but she stood her ground. But Caterina, what if she went willingly? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if she chose to leave? Don Antonio scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Isabella. She's a Romano. She would never betray her family. She was taken, kidnapped, brainwashed. Marco, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Mama has a point, Papa, he said, his voice cautious. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know what Vitali told her. We need to be careful. Don Antonio glared at his eldest son, his anger flaring. Careful? He repeated. We need to be ruthless. We need to show Vitali and everyone else that we will not tolerate this kind of disrespect. The argument continued, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Isabella felt helpless, trapped between her husband's rage and her own fears for her daughter's safety. She knew that Caterina was strong, resilient, but she was also vulnerable. She had been raised in a world of privilege and protection, shielded from the harsh realities of their life. She was not prepared for the violence, the ruthlessness that she had now been thrust into. Meanwhile, Alessandro Moretti, the jilted bridegroom, was a silent, brooding presence in the corner of the room. He had said little since Caterina's disappearance, his anger simmering beneath a veneer of icy calm. He was a proud man, a powerful man, and he had been publicly humiliated. His reputation, his honor, had been tarnished, and he would not rest until he had exacted his revenge. He had his own men searching for Caterina, his own network of informants working to uncover Vitali's whereabouts. He had no intention of relying on the Romanos to bring her back. He would handle this himself, in his own way. As the night wore on, the villa remained a hive of activity. Phones rang constantly, men came and went, whispered conversations filled the air. The search for Caterina was intensifying, the net tightening around Enzo and his captive. Isabella, alone in her room, prayed for her daughter's safety. She prayed that Caterina would find the strength to survive, the courage to make the right choices. She prayed that she would be able to see her daughter again, to hold her in her arms, to tell her that she loved her. But deep down, Isabella knew that the world had changed. Caterina's abduction had shattered the fragile peace, ignited a war that could consume them all. And she feared that her daughter, the innocent pawn in this deadly game, would be the one to pay the ultimate price. The weight of generations, of expectations, of unspoken rules and codes, pressed down on her, a suffocating burden. The echoes of past decisions, of choices made long before Caterina was even born, reverberated through the villa, a constant reminder of the price of power, the cost of loyalty. The silence of the empty ballroom was broken only by the occasional muffled sob from Isabella, a mother's grief, a premonition of the darkness that was yet to come. Chapter 9. A glimmer of forbidden desire. The safe house was quiet, the only sound the gentle rhythm of Enzo's breathing as he slept in the chair opposite the sofa where Caterina lay. She had been unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of her family, of the documents she had seen, of the impossible situation she was in. She watched Enzo, his face softened in sleep, the harsh lines of his jaw relaxed, the intensity of his gaze hidden beneath closed eyelids. He looked vulnerable. Younger. Less like the ruthless mafia boss and more like the boy he must have once been, before the world had hardened him, before the betrayal of his family had shaped him into the man he had become. Katerina felt a strange stirring within her, a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite define. Pity, empathy, and something else, something more dangerous. A flicker of attraction, a spark of desire that she knew she shouldn't feel, that she couldn't afford to feel. He was her enemy, the man who had stolen her from her own wedding, the man who represented everything her family stood against. She should hate him, should fear him, should be plotting her escape. But she couldn't deny the connection she felt to him, the understanding that had grown between them, the trust he had placed in her by revealing his family's secrets. She thought of the way he had looked at her, the intensity of his gaze, the way his hand had brushed against her cheek, the way he had said her name, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent shivers down her spine. She thought of the small acts of kindness, the new clothes, the book of poetry, the shared meals, the hesitant conversations. These were not the actions of a monster, of a ruthless kidnapper. They were the actions of a man who cared. A man who was capable of tenderness, of compassion, even in the midst of his quest for revenge. Katerina got up from the sofa, careful not to wake him. She walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, the darkness slowly giving way to light. She thought of her life before, of the gilded cage she had lived in, of the expectations that had been placed upon her, of the future that had been mapped out for her. She had been a pawn, a piece in a game of power, her own desires, her own dreams irrelevant. And now, here she was, a fugitive, hiding in a safe house with the enemy, her future uncertain, her life turned upside down. But strangely, she felt alive. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had agency, like she had made a choice, even if it was a dangerous one. She turned back to look at Enzo, still sleeping peacefully in the chair. She felt a pull towards him, an undeniable attraction that she knew was forbidden, dangerous, potentially destructive. But she couldn't deny it. It was there, simmering beneath the surface, a spark of desire that threatened to ignite into something more. She walked over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for a moment, watching him sleep, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, the curve of his lips, the dark lashes that framed his closed eyes. She reached out, her hand hovering over his face, her fingers trembling. She wanted to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin, to smooth away the lines of worry that creased his forehead. But she stopped herself. She couldn't. It was too dangerous. It was too risky. She was playing with fire, and she knew she could get burned. She pulled her hand back, her heart aching with a longing she couldn't express, a desire she couldn't fulfill. She turned and walked back to the sofa, curling up under the blanket, her gaze fixed on Enzo, her mind filled with conflicting emotions. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the room. Enzo stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at Katerina, his gaze meeting hers. A moment of silent understanding passed between them, a shared awareness of the unspoken tension, the forbidden desire that simmered beneath the surface. It was a dangerous game they were playing, a dance on the edge of a precipice. And they both knew it. But in that moment, in the quiet intimacy of the safe house, the world outside, the war that raged between their families, seemed to fade away. There was only them, two souls caught in a web of circumstance, drawn together by a force they couldn't control, a desire they couldn't deny. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of unfulfilled longing, with the promise of something that could be beautiful, dangerous, and utterly transformative. Chapter 10. Echoes of Betrayal and Loyalty. The discovery of the documents had stirred something deep within Katerina, a sense of unease, a questioning of everything she had ever believed. She needed answers, confirmation, some kind of validation of the truth Enzo had revealed. She knew she couldn't go to her family, not directly. They would deny everything, dismiss it as Vitali propaganda, further entrench themselves in their lies. She decided to seek out someone else, someone on the periphery of the family, someone who might know the truth, someone who might be willing to talk. She thought of her Aunt Sophia, her father's younger sister, a woman who had always been somewhat of an outsider, a woman who had never fully embraced the family's ruthless ways. Sophia lived in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a world away from the opulence and grandeur of the Romano villa. She had never married, had dedicated her life to her art, creating beautiful, intricate mosaics that adorned churches and public spaces throughout the city. Katerina knew it was risky, contacting her aunt. She was putting both herself and Sophia in danger. But she had to know the truth. She had to understand the past, to make sense of the present, to decide her future. She waited until late one evening, when she knew Enzo would be occupied with his own affairs. She slipped out of the safe house, her heart pounding in her chest, the city feeling both familiar and foreign. She took a circuitous route, avoiding the main streets, her senses on high alert, constantly looking over her shoulder. She reached Sophia's apartment, her hand trembling as she knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, and Sophia stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. "Katerina?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "It's not safe. I need to talk to you, Aunt Sophia," Katerina said, her voice urgent. "It's important. It's about the family, about the Vitalis." Sophia's face paled. She glanced around nervously, then pulled Katerina inside, closing and locking the door behind them. "What is it?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. "What's happened?" Katerina took a deep breath, then told her aunt everything. She told her about Enzo, about the documents, about the betrayal, about the lies she had been told her entire life. Sophia listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly pained as Katerina spoke. When Katerina finished, Sophia let out a long, shaky sigh. "I knew," Sophia said softly, her voice filled with sadness. "I knew parts of it anyway. I suspected the rest." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Katerina asked, her voice laced with a mixture of anger and hurt. Sophia looked down, her hands clasped tightly together. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of your father, afraid of what he would do. He has a way of silencing people, of making them disappear." "But it's not right," Katerina said. "It's not fair. The Vitalis, they were wronged. Enzo, he's not the monster I was told he was." Sophia nodded. "No," she agreed. "He's not. He's a victim. Just like you, Katerina. Just like all of us." "What do I do?" Katerina asked, her voice pleading. "What can I do?" Sophia looked at her niece, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like admiration. "You've already done more than you know, Katerina," Sophia said. "By seeking the truth, by questioning the lies, you've taken the first step. You've broken the cycle." "But my family," Katerina said. "They'll never forgive me. They'll see me as a traitor." "Perhaps," Sophia said. "But you have to choose, Katerina. You have to choose between loyalty to your family and loyalty to the truth. You have to choose between the life you were born into and the life you want to live." Sophia's words resonated deeply within Katerina. She knew her aunt was right. She had a choice to make. A difficult, dangerous choice, but a choice that was hers to make. She spent the rest of the evening with Sophia, talking, sharing stories, finding solace in her aunt's quiet wisdom. As she left the apartment, the city felt different. The darkness no longer seemed so menacing, the shadows no longer so threatening. She had found an ally, a confidant, someone who understood, someone who believed her. And she had found something else, something within herself. A strength she didn't know she possessed, a courage to face the truth, a determination to forge her own path. The echoes of the past still lingered, the weight of betrayal and loyalty still heavy, but Katerina felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose, a resolve to confront the storm that was brewing, to fight for what she believed in, even if it meant facing the wrath of her own family. The city lights seemed to shine a little brighter, the night air felt a little less oppressive, and Katerina walked with a newfound determination, her steps echoing the resolve that was growing within her heart. Chapter 11. The city holds its breath. Naples was a city on edge, a pressure cooker about to explode. The disappearance of Caterina Romano had sent shockwaves through the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that defined the underworld. The fragile peace that had existed between the families was shattered, replaced by a tense, volatile atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Detective Isabella Rossi felt it in her gut. She had been working around the clock, trying to piece together the events of that fateful night, trying to find any clue that would lead her to Caterina, to Enzo Vitali. She had interviewed countless witnesses, reviewed security footage, interrogated informants, but she had come up empty. It was as if Caterina and Enzo had vanished into thin air. She knew the Romanos and the Morettis were conducting their own searches, their methods far more brutal and ruthless than her own. She had heard whispers of threats, of violence, of a city teetering on the brink of all-out war. She sat at her desk, staring at the photographs spread out before her. Caterina's face, beautiful and innocent, stared back at her, a silent plea for help. Enzo's face, hard and enigmatic, challenged her, dared her to find him. Marco Leone, her partner, entered the office, his expression grim. "Anything?" he asked. Isabella shook her head. "Nothing concrete," she replied. "It's like they disappeared off the face of the earth." "The Romanos are getting restless," Marco said. "They're demanding action. They're threatening to take matters into their own hands." "And the Morettis?" Isabella asked. "They're playing it closer to the vest," Marco replied. "But they're just as determined. They want revenge." Isabella sighed. She knew the situation was spiraling out of control. She had to find Caterina, and she had to find her soon, before the city erupted into violence. She decided to take a different approach. She decided to focus on the past, on the long-standing feud between the Romanos and the Vitalis. She knew that the key to understanding the present lay in unraveling the secrets of the past. She spent hours poring over old case files, police reports, newspaper articles, anything that could shed light on the history of the two families. She discovered a pattern of violence, of betrayals, of power struggles that stretched back generations. She learned about the partnership between Caterina's grandfather and Enzo's father, about the betrayal that had shattered their alliance, about the years of bloodshed that had followed. She realized that Caterina's abduction was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest chapter in a long and bloody saga. The more she learned, the more she understood Enzo's motives, his desire for revenge, his determination to take back what he believed was rightfully his. She didn't condone his methods, but she understood the pain, the anger that drove him. She also realized that Caterina was not just a victim, but a pawn in a much larger game. She was a symbol of the Romano family, a symbol of their power, their wealth, their legacy. And by taking her, Enzo had struck a blow at the very heart of their empire. Isabella's phone. It was an anonymous number. A man's raspy, modulated voice filled the static. Detective Rossi. The voice whispered, "Vitali has her." Isabella's body stiffened. "Who is this? Where?" The line clicked.
Dead.
Isabella slammed the phone. She looked at Marco, her eyes blazing. She knew time was running out and that she had to get to Caterina. Isabella stood up, her mind racing. She had a new lead, a new direction to pursue. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that she was getting closer to the truth, closer to finding Caterina. The city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The tension was palpable, the fear contagious. The streets were quieter than usual, the cafes less crowded, the people wary and watchful. The storm was coming, and everyone knew it. And in the midst of it all, Isabella Rossi, a lone detective, armed with her wits and her determination, was racing against time to prevent a bloodbath, to save a young woman's life, to bring justice to a city that had long been ruled by violence and fear. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the occasional wail of a siren, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked around every corner. Chapter 12. A dance of danger and desire. The days in the safe house had settled into a rhythm, a strange, intimate dance between captivity and connection. Katerina and Enzo circled each other, drawn together by an undeniable attraction, yet kept apart by the weight of their families' histories, by the dangerous game they were playing. They talked, sharing stories, revealing vulnerabilities, their conversations hesitant at first, then growing bolder, more intimate. Katerina learned more about Enzo's childhood, about the loss of his father, about the years he had spent planning his revenge. She saw the pain in his eyes, the bitterness that consumed him, but she also saw glimpses of something else, a gentleness, a vulnerability, a longing for something more. Enzo, in turn, learned about Katerina's life, about the constraints of her upbringing, about her dreams of freedom, about her quiet rebellion against the expectations placed upon her. He saw her strength, her resilience, her intelligence, but he also saw her innocence, her naivete, her vulnerability. The attraction between them simmered beneath the surface, a constant tension that filled the small space they shared. It was in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hands brushed accidentally, in the way their voices softened when they spoke. It was a forbidden desire, a dangerous game, but they couldn't deny it. One evening, as they were sharing a simple meal, Enzo broke the silence.
Why did you come with me, Katerina?
He asked, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. Why did you choose to leave your life behind? Katerina hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had asked herself the same question countless times. She knew the logical answers, the fear of marrying Alessandro, the desire for freedom, the realization of her family's lies. But there was something more, something she couldn't quite articulate. I don't know, she said finally, her voice trembling.
It was a choice.
A leap of faith. I felt trapped. Like I had no control over my own life.
And now?
Enzo asked, his gaze unwavering. Do you feel free? Katerina looked at him, at the intensity in his eyes, at the vulnerability that flickered beneath the surface. She felt a pull towards him, an undeniable attraction that defied logic, that defied reason. I don't know, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. I'm still a prisoner, in a way. But it's different. I'm with you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Enzo reached out, his hand gently touching hers. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a spark of electricity that ignited something deep within her. Katerina, he said, his voice husky, his eyes burning into hers. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the touch of his hand, said it all. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the scent of his cologne, a mix of leather and spice. She knew she should pull away, should resist, should maintain the distance between them. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, mesmerized by his presence, by the intensity of his gaze. He closed the gap between them, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. Katerina's breath caught in her throat. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them. The kiss deepened, a slow, sensual exploration, a release of pent-up emotions, a collision of two worlds. It was a dance of danger and desire, a moment of vulnerability and surrender, a forbidden connection that defied the boundaries of their warring families. Katerina's hands moved to his shoulders, clinging to him, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. Enzo's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, his embrace both protective and possessive. The world outside, the war that raged between their families, the danger that lurked around every corner, faded away. There was only them, two souls caught in a web of circumstance, drawn together by a force they couldn't control, a desire they couldn't deny. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began, leaving them both breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. They stared at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of longing, confusion, and fear. Enzo, Katerina whispered, her voice trembling. We shouldn't. He nodded, his expression pained. I know, he said, his voice hoarse. But I can't help myself. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. You are beautiful, Katerina, he said. And dangerous.
To me.
To everything I've planned. The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the reality of their situation. They were playing with fire, and they both knew it. But in that moment, in the quiet intimacy of the safe house, the danger seemed irresistible. The air crackled with unspoken desires, with the weight of their shared secret, with the promise of something that could be both beautiful and destructive. Chapter 13. The price of freedom's pursuit. The consequences of their actions were swift and brutal. The kiss, the shared moment of vulnerability and desire, had shattered the fragile truce, the careful distance they had maintained. It had ignited a firestorm, a chain of events that would put them both in mortal danger. Enzo, consumed by guilt and a renewed sense of purpose, became more distant, more withdrawn. He spent hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold determination. He was planning something, Katerina knew, something dangerous, something that would escalate the conflict between their families. Katerina, torn between her growing feelings for Enzo and her loyalty to her family, found herself increasingly isolated, trapped in a web of conflicting emotions. She knew she had crossed a line, that she had betrayed her family, that she had fallen for the enemy. But she couldn't deny the connection she felt to Enzo, the understanding that had grown between them, the desire that still simmered beneath the surface. One evening, Enzo returned to the safe house, his face pale, his expression grim. "We have to move," he said, his voice urgent. "They know. They're coming." Katerina's heart leaped into her throat. "Who knows?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My family?"
Alessandro?
"Both," Enzo replied. "They've found us. We have to leave."
Now.
They fled the safe house, their escape even more hurried and desperate than before. They moved through the city's underbelly, navigating a labyrinth of dark alleys and hidden passages, Enzo's knowledge of the city's secret routes their only advantage. They were being hunted, pursued by both the Romanos and the Morettis, their combined forces a formidable threat. Enzo had made enemies, powerful enemies, and they were closing in. Katerina saw a different side of Enzo now, a ruthlessness, a cold determination that she had only glimpsed before. He was a warrior, a fighter, and he would do whatever it took to protect himself, to protect her. They found refuge in another safe house, even more secluded and secure than the last. It was a small, hidden apartment, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, a place where no one would think to look. But the danger was palpable, the tension thick and suffocating. They were trapped, cornered, their options dwindling. Katerina realized the price of her freedom, the cost of her choices. She had chosen to leave her life behind, to follow Enzo, to embrace the unknown. But now, she was facing the consequences, the wrath of her family, the vengeance of Alessandro, the violence that was an inevitable part of their world. She looked at Enzo, at the man who had stolen her away, at the man who had shown her a different world, at the man she had fallen in love with. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of his family's legacy, the responsibility he felt for her safety. "I'm scared," Katerina whispered, her voice trembling. Enzo reached out, his hand gently touching hers. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." It was a promise he had made before, a promise that had carried the weight of his family's honor. But now it was something more. It was a promise born of love, of desire, of a connection that defied the boundaries of their warring families. But promises, Katerina knew, were fragile things in their world. They could be broken, betrayed, shattered by the forces that were arrayed against them. They were running out of time, running out of options. The walls were closing in, the danger escalating. The price of freedom, Katerina realized, was high, and she might have to pay the ultimate price. The air was thick with anticipation, with the knowledge that their sanctuary could be breached at any moment, with the understanding that their desperate flight was nearing its end. The city outside, once a refuge, now felt like a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Chapter 14. Scars of the past, hopes for the future. The confinement of the new safe house pressed in on Katerina. It was smaller, more claustrophobic than the last, the lack of windows making it feel like a tomb. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant siren, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked outside. Enzo was gone more often now, his absences longer, his returns marked by a growing weariness, a deepening of the lines around his eyes. He spoke little, his silence a heavy presence in the small space. Katerina knew he was working, planning, fighting a war on multiple fronts. She worried about him, about the risks he was taking, about the toll it was taking on him. She spent her days pacing the small room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She thought of her family, of the life she had left behind, of the choices she had made. She thought of Enzo, of the connection they shared, of the forbidden love that had blossomed between them, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. One afternoon, while Enzo was gone, Katerina found a small, dusty box tucked away in a corner of the room. Curiosity piqued. She opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and letters. They were Enzo's, mementos of his past, of his family, of the life that had been stolen from him. She saw photographs of a young Enzo, a boy with a mischievous grin and bright, hopeful eyes. She saw photographs of his parents, a handsome couple, their faces filled with love and laughter. She saw photographs of his father with Katerina's grandfather, their arms around each other's shoulders, their bond seemingly unbreakable. She read the letters, handwritten in Italian, their words filled with love, with loss, with a longing for justice. She read letters from Enzo's mother to his father, expressing her fears, her anxieties, her unwavering love. She read letters from Enzo to his father, after his father's death, expressing his grief, his anger, his vow for revenge. The photographs and letters brought Enzo's past to life, giving her a deeper understanding of the man he was, of the pain he carried, of the motivations that drove him. She saw the scars of his past, the wounds that had shaped him, the burdens he carried. When Enzo returned, he found Katerina sitting on the floor, surrounded by the photographs and letters, tears streaming down her face. He knelt beside her, his expression softening. "Katerina," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I found these," she said, gesturing to the box. "I saw your past, your family, your pain." Enzo's face clouded over. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't have looked at those," he said, his voice gruff. "They're private." "I know," Katerina said. "But I needed to understand. I needed to see who you really are." She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "Enzo," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I see you. I see your pain. I see your strength. I see your heart." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the tears in her eyes, the empathy, the understanding. He saw the love that she offered, a love that defied the boundaries of their warring families, a love that transcended the violence and the hatred. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "Katerina," he said, his voice husky, you see too much. You see things I try to hide. And I love you," Katerina said, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration, a confession, a surrender. Enzo's eyes widened in surprise. He had not expected this, had not allowed himself to hope for this. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling. "Katerina," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. I love you too. More than I ever thought possible." It was a moment of vulnerability, of surrender, of hope. A moment where the scars of the past met the hopes for the future. A moment where two souls, bound by a forbidden love, found solace in each other's embrace. But even in that moment of intimacy, the reality of their situation loomed. They were still trapped, still hunted, still facing an uncertain future. The love they shared was a fragile thing, a flickering flame in the midst of a raging storm. But it was also a source of strength, a beacon of hope, a reason to keep fighting. The silence of the safe house was filled with the unspoken promise of their love, with the weight of their shared burdens, with the fragile hope that they might, somehow, find a way to build a future together, a future free from the violence and the hatred that had defined their pasts. Chapter 15. A confrontation of old rivals. The meeting was set, a clandestine rendezvous, arranged through intermediaries, a desperate attempt to negotiate a truce to prevent all-out war. Enzo had agreed to meet with Alessandro Moretti, a face-to-face confrontation, a showdown between old rivals. Caterina pleaded with him not to go, her fear palpable. She knew it was a trap, a dangerous gamble, that Alessandro could not be trusted. But Enzo was adamant. He had to try. He had to find a way to end the violence, to protect Caterina, to secure their future. He left the safe house under the cover of darkness, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold determination. Caterina watched him go, her heart filled with dread, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She waited, the hours stretching into an eternity, the silence of the safe house amplifying her anxiety. She paced the small room, her every sense on high alert, listening for any sound, any sign of Enzo's return. The meeting was to take place at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a neutral ground, a place where neither family held an advantage. It was a risky proposition, a volatile situation, a powder keg waiting to explode. Enzo arrived at the warehouse, his senses heightened, his hand resting on the gun concealed beneath his jacket. He was accompanied by two of his most trusted men, their presence a silent warning, a show of force. Alessandro Moretti was already there, waiting for him. He was surrounded by his own men, their faces hard, their eyes filled with animosity. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the city. "Vitali," Alessandro said, his voice cold, his eyes filled with contempt. "You have something that belongs to me." "She is not a possession, Moretti," Enzo replied, his voice equally cold. "She is a woman. And she chose to leave." "She was promised to me," Alessandro retorted. "You stole her. You violated an agreement. An agreement based on lies, on betrayal," Enzo countered. "An agreement that your family and hers used to destroy mine." The argument escalated, the words laced with venom, the accusations flying back and forth. The history of their families, the years of bloodshed, the betrayals, the grievances, all came pouring out. "This ends tonight, Vitali," Alessandro said, his voice filled with a deadly calm. "You will return Caterina, and you will pay for your insolence." "I will not return her," Enzo replied. "She is with me, and she will stay with me." The tension reached a breaking point. Hands moved to weapons, eyes narrowed, the air crackling with anticipation. A single shot, a single spark, could ignite a bloodbath. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Caterina. She had followed Enzo, unable to bear the thought of him facing this danger alone. "Stop!" Caterina cried, her voice echoing through the warehouse. "This has to end. The violence, the hatred, it has to stop." Both Enzo and Alessandro were stunned by her appearance, their anger momentarily forgotten. They stared at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and confusion. "Caterina?" Enzo said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." "I had to come," Caterina said, her voice trembling but firm. "I had to try to stop this. I won't let anyone else get hurt. Not because of me." She turned to Alessandro, her eyes pleading. "Alessandro," she said, "please. This isn't the way. This isn't what I want. I don't want to be a part of this anymore." Alessandro's face hardened. He looked at Caterina, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked like regret. "You chose him," Alessandro said, his voice low. "You chose Vitali. You betrayed your family. You betrayed me." "I chose freedom," Caterina replied. "I chose love. I chose a different path." She stepped forward, taking the space between the two men, all eyes on her. This cycle, all the death, it ends here. It ends now. The warehouse was silent, the tension still palpable, but the immediate threat of violence had subsided. Katerina's presence had changed the dynamic, shifted the focus, forced a moment of reflection. The confrontation had reached a stalemate, an impasse. The old rivals stood face to face, their hatred still simmering, but the possibility of a different outcome, a different future, had emerged. The air was heavy with uncertainty, with the knowledge that one wrong move could still ignite the violence, with the fragile hope that Katerina's intervention might, just might, pave the way for peace. Chapter 16. The Unraveling of Truths. Katerina's unexpected appearance at the warehouse had created a ripple effect, a shift in the delicate balance of power. Alessandro, though still seething with anger and a sense of betrayal, had been forced to reconsider his position. He had seen the determination in Katerina's eyes, the genuine plea for an end to the violence. He had also seen the connection between her and Enzo, a bond that defied the boundaries of their warring families. He had retreated, his men following suit, the immediate threat of violence averted. But the war was far from over. The underlying tensions remained, the desire for revenge still simmering beneath the surface. Enzo, shaken by Katerina's near-death intervention, had returned to the safe house with her, his emotions a turbulent mix of relief, anger, and a deepening love. He knew she had risked her life for him, for them, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily upon him. In the days that followed, a fragile truce settled over the city. The Romanos and the Morettis remained at odds, their forces poised for conflict, but the open warfare had subsided. There were whispers, rumors, negotiations taking place behind the scenes, a desperate attempt to find a resolution, to prevent further bloodshed. Detective Isabella Rossi, meanwhile, had been relentlessly pursuing her investigation, piecing together the fragments of information, following the trail of clues. She had learned about the meeting at the warehouse, about Katerina's intervention, about the uneasy truce that had been established. She knew that the situation was still volatile, that the peace could shatter at any moment. She also knew that Katerina held the key to unlocking the truth, to exposing the secrets that had fueled the conflict for generations. Isabella decided to take a risk. She arranged a secret meeting with Katerina, a clandestine rendezvous, a chance to hear her side of the story, to understand her choices, to find a way to bring the conflict to an end. They met in a small, secluded cafe, a neutral ground, a place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Katerina was hesitant at first, wary of the detective, unsure of her motives. But Isabella's sincerity, her genuine concern for Katerina's safety, her determination to find justice, gradually won her over. Katerina told Isabella everything. She told her about Enzo, about the documents, about the betrayal, about the love that had blossomed between them. She told her about her family, about the lies she had been told, about the pressure she had been under, about her desire for freedom. Isabella listened intently, her eyes filled with understanding. She saw the pain in Katerina's eyes, the strength, the resilience, the determination to forge a different path. "I believe you," Katerina, Isabella said. "I believe your story. And I believe you can help me end this. You can help me bring the truth to light." Katerina hesitated. She knew that revealing the truth would have consequences, that it would expose her family, that it could ignite further conflict. But she also knew that it was the right thing to do. She couldn't live with the lies any longer. She couldn't let the violence continue. "What do I need to do?"
Katerina asked.
Isabella explained her plan, a carefully orchestrated strategy to expose the truth, to bring the guilty parties to justice, to create a lasting peace. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was their best hope. Katerina agreed to cooperate, to testify, to reveal everything she knew. She knew she was putting herself in danger, that she was betraying her family, that she might face their wrath. But she was also taking control of her own destiny, choosing truth over loyalty, choosing love over fear. The unraveling of truths had begun. The secrets that had been buried for generations were slowly coming to light. The foundations of power, built on lies and betrayal, were beginning to crumble. The city held its breath, waiting for the final reckoning, for the storm that was sure to follow. The air was thick with anticipation, with the knowledge that the truth, once revealed, would change everything, that the old order would be shattered, that a new era might, just might, dawn. Chapter 17. A desperate plea for redemption. The news of Caterina's cooperation with the police sent shockwaves through the Romano family. Don Antonio was enraged, his fury a terrifying force. He saw Caterina's actions as the ultimate betrayal, a stain on the family's honor that could never be erased. "She is dead to us," he roared, his voice echoing through the villa. "She is no longer a Romano. She is a traitor, and she will pay the price." Marco and Luca, torn between their loyalty to their family and their concern for their sister, tried to reason with their father, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. He was consumed by rage, by the need for vengeance. Isabella Romano, however, felt a flicker of hope amidst the despair. She had always known that Caterina was different, that she possessed a strength, a moral compass, that set her apart from the rest of the family. She saw Caterina's actions not as a betrayal, but as a courageous attempt to break the cycle of violence, to find a path to redemption. She secretly reached out to Caterina, arranging a clandestine meeting, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. They met in a small, hidden chapel, a place of sanctuary, a place where they could speak freely, without fear of being overheard. Caterina was hesitant at first, wary of her mother, unsure of her intentions. But Isabella's sincerity, her genuine remorse for the lies, the manipulation, the years of silence, gradually won her over. "Caterina, cara," Isabella said, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry.
For everything.
For the life you were forced to live, for the choices you were denied, for the pain you have endured." Caterina looked at her mother, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, hurt, and a lingering love. She had longed for her mother's understanding, her support, her acceptance. "Mama," Caterina said, her voice soft.
"Why?
"Why did you stay silent? Why did you let it happen?" Isabella sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of your father. Afraid of what he would do. I was weak. I chose the easy path, the path of silence, the path of complicity."
"But you knew," Caterina said.
"You knew the truth." Isabella nodded.
"Yes," she said.
"I knew. And I lived with that guilt, that shame, every day of my life." She reached out, her hand gently touching Caterina's arm. "But you, Caterina," she said. "You are different. You are strong. You are brave. You have the courage to do what I could not. You have the courage to break the cycle. But at what cost?"
Caterina asked.
"My family, they hate me. They want me dead."
"Not all of them," Isabella said.
"Marco, he understands.
He cares about you.
He wants to protect you." She paused, her eyes searching Caterina's. "And I want to help you," she said. "I want to make amends. I want to be the mother you deserve." It was a desperate plea for redemption, a mother's attempt to heal the wounds she had inflicted, to bridge the gap that had separated them. Caterina saw the sincerity in her mother's eyes, the genuine remorse, the love that had always been there, buried beneath layers of fear and guilt. She reached out, her hand covering her mother's. "Mama," she said, her voice filled with emotion. I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I want to try." It was a start, a fragile beginning, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. The wounds were deep, the scars would remain, but the possibility of healing, of reconciliation, had emerged. Isabella pulled Caterina into a tight embrace, her tears falling onto her daughter's hair. It was a moment of release, of connection, of a shared pain that transcended the betrayals, the lies, the violence. They made a plan, a dangerous plan, to expose Don Antonio, to bring him to justice, to end his reign of terror. Isabella would provide the evidence, the inside information, the testimony that would corroborate Caterina's story. It was a risky gamble, a betrayal of her husband, a defiance of the family code. But Isabella was willing to risk everything, to atone for her past sins, to protect her daughter, to secure a future free from violence and fear. The chapel, once a symbol of silence and complicity, became a sanctuary of hope, a place where a mother and daughter, united by a shared desire for redemption, plotted to bring down a tyrant, to break the chains of the past, to forge a new path forward. The air was thick with a sense of purpose, with the weight of their decision, with the fragile hope that they might, just might, succeed. Chapter 18. The Gathering Storm's Fury. The pieces were falling into place. Isabella Rossi, with Caterina and Isabella Romano's cooperation, had gathered enough evidence to build a case against Don Antonio Romano. Warrants were issued, arrests were planned, a carefully orchestrated operation to bring down the Romano Empire was set in motion. But Don Antonio was not a man to be taken down easily. He had his own network of informants, his own sources of power, his own contingency plans. He knew that the authorities were closing in, that his empire was crumbling, that his own family had betrayed him. His rage was terrifying, his desperation palpable. He gathered his loyal men, his most trusted soldiers, preparing for a final stand, a desperate attempt to maintain his power, to escape justice, to punish those who had dared to defy him. The city held its breath, the tension reaching a fever pitch. The fragile truce that had existed between the families was shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of impending violence, of all-out war. Enzo, aware of the escalating danger, moved Caterina to an even more secure location, a remote villa in the countryside, a place where he hoped she would be safe from the coming storm. He surrounded her with his most trusted men, his loyal soldiers, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that loomed. He knew that Don Antonio would come for her, that he would see her as the ultimate prize, the symbol of his lost power, the key to his revenge. He was prepared to defend her, to protect her with his life. The gathering storm finally broke. The police launched their operation, raiding Romano properties, arresting his associates, seizing his assets. Don Antonio, however, had anticipated their move. He had gone underground, disappearing into the city's underbelly, his loyal men protecting him, his escape route prepared. He left a trail of destruction in his wake, a series of violent attacks, a desperate attempt to destabilize the city, to create chaos, to regain control. The streets erupted in gunfire, the sounds of sirens filling the air, the city descending into a state of anarchy. Enzo received word of the escalating violence, of Don Antonio's escape, of the danger that Caterina was in. He knew he had to get to her, to protect her, to bring her to safety. He left the safe house, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold determination. He moved through the city's underbelly, navigating the chaos, his every sense on high alert, his hand resting on the gun concealed beneath his jacket. He reached the villa, his heart pounding in his chest, the fear for Caterina's safety consuming him. He found her surrounded by his men, their faces tense, their weapons drawn. "Caterina," he said, his voice filled with relief. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear.
"Enzo," she said.
"What's happening? What's going on?" He explained the situation, the escalating violence, Don Antonio's escape, the danger they were in. He told her they had to leave, to move to an even more secure location, to escape the city, to disappear. They prepared to flee, their movements hurried, their senses heightened. But it was too late. Don Antonio's men had found them. They surrounded the villa, their weapons trained, their faces filled with a cold, ruthless determination. The storm had reached its peak. The final confrontation was at hand. The battle for Caterina's life, for Enzo's love, for the future of the city, was about to begin. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, with the sounds of shouting, with the imminent threat of violence. The villa, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground, a place where the past and the present collided, a place where destinies would be decided. Chapter 19. Love's Ultimate Sacrifice. The siege of the villa was swift and brutal. Don Antonio's men, fueled by rage and a desperate loyalty to their leader, attacked with a ferocity that was terrifying. Enzo and his men, outnumbered but determined to protect Caterina, fought back with equal intensity. The sounds of gunfire, of shattering glass, of shouting and screams, filled the air. The villa, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, became a scene of chaos and destruction. Caterina, huddled in a small room, her heart pounding in her chest, listened to the sounds of the battle raging outside. She was terrified, not for herself, but for Enzo, for the men who were risking their lives to protect her. She knew that Don Antonio would stop at nothing to get to her, to punish her for her betrayal, to reclaim his lost power. She also knew that Enzo would never surrender, that he would fight to the death to defend her. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity. Enzo, his face grim, his clothes torn and bloodied, fought with a skill and determination that was both inspiring and terrifying. He moved through the villa, a whirlwind of motion, his gun blazing, his every move calculated, his focus unwavering. He was protecting Caterina, the woman he loved, the woman who had changed his life, the woman who had given him hope. He would not let her fall into Don Antonio's hands. He would not let her be harmed. But Don Antonio's men were relentless. They kept coming, wave after wave, their numbers overwhelming. Enzo's men were falling, one by one, their defenses weakening. Enzo knew they were losing. He knew that time was running out. He had to get Caterina to safety. He had to find a way to escape. He fought his way back to the room where Caterina was hiding, his body aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed her hand, his grip tight, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency.
Caterina, he said.
We have to go.
Now.
He led her through the villa, navigating the chaos, avoiding the gunfire, his every move protecting her, shielding her from harm. They reached a back door, a possible escape route. But as they were about to slip out, Don Antonio appeared, his face twisted with rage, his gun trained on Enzo. It ends here, Vitali.
He roared.
You will not escape. You will not take her from me. Enzo pushed Caterina behind him, shielding her with his body. He stood defiant, his eyes locked on Don Antonio's, his own gun raised. It ends here, Romano, Enzo replied, his voice cold, his determination unwavering. But not the way you think. A tense standoff ensued, the two men facing each other, their hatred palpable, their guns trained. The air was thick with anticipation, with the knowledge that one wrong move, one shot, would determine the outcome. Suddenly, a shot rang out. But it wasn't from Enzo's gun, nor from Don Antonio's. It was from Marco, Caterina's brother. He had arrived at the villa, his loyalty to his family warring with his love for his sister. He had made his choice. He had chosen Caterina. He had chosen love over loyalty. Don Antonio crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief, his body riddled with bullets. The battle was over. The siege had ended. But the victory was bittersweet. Enzo, seeing Don Antonio raise his weapon towards Marco, had instinctively moved to block the shot. The bullet that had been meant for Marco struck Enzo in the chest. Caterina screamed, rushing to Enzo's side, her hands trembling as she tried to stem the bleeding. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. Caterina, he whispered, his voice weak. I love you. Those were his last words. He closed his eyes, his body going limp. He was gone. Caterina held him close, her tears streaming down her face, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She had lost him, the man she loved, the man who had saved her, the man who had shown her a different world. The price of freedom, the cost of love had been paid. The storm had passed, but the devastation remained. The future was uncertain, the path ahead unclear. But in the midst of the loss, the grief, the pain, there was also a glimmer of hope. The cycle of violence had been broken. The truth had been revealed. A new era had begun. And Caterina, though heartbroken, was free. The villa, silent now, stood as a testament to the battle that had been fought, to the love that had been lost, to the sacrifices that had been made. The air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder, with the lingering echoes of violence, with the profound sadness of a love story cut short. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The aftermath of the siege was a whirlwind of chaos and grief. The police arrived, taking control of the scene, arresting Don Antonio's surviving men, tending to the wounded. Marco, his face etched with sorrow and guilt, stayed by Caterina's side, his presence a silent apology, a promise of protection. Caterina, numb with shock and grief, allowed herself to be led away, her mind reeling, her heart shattered. She had lost Enzo, the man she loved, the man who had sacrificed his life for her. She had also lost her father, the man who had ruled her life, the man who had caused so much pain and destruction. The days that followed were a blur. There were police interrogations, legal proceedings, funeral arrangements. Caterina moved through it all in a daze, her emotions raw, her grief overwhelming. She testified against her father, revealing everything she knew, exposing the truth about his crimes, about the betrayal of the Vitali family, about the years of violence and corruption. Her testimony, along with Isabella Romano's corroborating evidence, was instrumental in bringing down the Romano Empire. Don Antonio, weakened by his injuries, was eventually found to be fit to stand trial. He was found guilty, sentenced, and put away, his reign of terror finally over. The city of Naples breathed a collective sigh of relief. The cycle of violence that had plagued it for generations had been broken. A new era of peace, of justice had begun. But for Caterina, the victory was hollow. She had achieved her freedom, but at a terrible cost. She had lost the man she loved, the man who had shown her a different world, the man who had given her hope. She visited Enzo's grave, a simple headstone in a quiet cemetery overlooking the sea. She stood there for hours, her tears flowing freely, her heart aching with grief. "I love you, Enzo," she whispered. "I will never forget you. I will always remember your sacrifice. I will live my life for both of us." She made a vow, a promise to Enzo, to herself, to the future. She would honor his memory by living a life of purpose, a life of compassion, a life free from violence and hatred. She would use her freedom to make a difference, to help others, to build a better world. She reconciled with her mother, their relationship strained but slowly healing. They found solace in each other's grief, in their shared loss, in their determination to move forward. Marco, too, sought redemption. He distanced himself from the family's criminal past, dedicating his life to helping those who had been harmed by his father's actions. He became a source of support for Caterina, a brother in the truest sense of the word. As the months passed, Caterina slowly began to heal. The pain of Enzo's loss would always be with her, a scar on her heart, but she found strength in his memory, in his sacrifice, in the love they had shared. She found a new purpose, a new direction in her life. She used her inheritance, the wealth that had been built on lies and violence, to create a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping victims of organized crime, to supporting education, to promoting peace. She became a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for justice, a symbol of hope for a city that had long been shrouded in darkness. She had found her calling, her purpose, her way to honor Enzo's memory, to build a better future. The final confrontation had been a battle of hearts and loyalties, a clash between the past and the future, a struggle for freedom and love. The cost had been high, the sacrifices immense, but the outcome, though bittersweet, was ultimately one of hope. Caterina, the reluctant bride, the stolen captive, had emerged as a strong, independent woman, a force for change, a beacon of light in a world that had long been dominated by darkness. The city, scarred but resilient, was slowly healing, rebuilding, embracing a new era of peace and justice. And Caterina, though her heart would forever bear the mark of her loss, had found her own path, her own purpose, her own way to live a life worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. The air, once thick with violence and fear, was now filled with a sense of possibility, with the promise of a brighter future, with the enduring power of love and redemption. Epilogue. Years later, Katerina stood on a windswept cliff overlooking the shimmering turquoise waters of the Mediterranean. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. It was a breathtaking view, a scene of peace and tranquility, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos she had once known. She was no longer the young, naive woman who had been stolen away from her own wedding. She was older now, wiser, her face etched with the lines of experience, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding, a quiet strength. She had built a life for herself, a life of purpose, a life of meaning. She had become a respected figure in the community, a philanthropist, an advocate for justice, a voice for the voiceless. She had honored Enzo's memory, fulfilling the vow she had made to him, living her life for both of them. The foundation she had created had flourished, making a real difference in the lives of countless people. She had helped victims of organized crime rebuild their lives, had supported education programs, had promoted peace and reconciliation. She had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, a living embodiment of the change she had fought so hard to achieve. She had found love again, a gentle, kind man who understood her past, who supported her work, who shared her vision for a better future. He was not Enzo, and he would never replace him, but he had brought joy back into her life, a quiet happiness, a sense of companionship. She had children, a son and a daughter, who were her pride and joy. She had raised them with love, with compassion, with a deep understanding of the importance of justice, of equality, of peace. She had taught them about their history, about the mistakes of the past, about the sacrifices that had been made, about the importance of choosing a different path. She often came to this cliff, this special place, to reflect, to remember, to find solace. She would look out at the sea, at the endless horizon, and think of Enzo, of the love they had shared, of the life they had dreamed of together. She would feel the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, and she would feel grateful. Grateful for the life she had been given, grateful for the opportunities she had had, grateful for the love she had known. She had found peace, a quiet contentment, a sense of fulfillment. She had overcome the darkness, had emerged from the storm, had found her own path, her own purpose. She had learned that love, in its many forms, was the most powerful force in the world. It could heal, it could transform, it could inspire, it could conquer even the deepest of wounds. She had learned that freedom was not just the absence of constraints, but the ability to choose one's own destiny, to live a life of purpose, to make a difference in the world. She had learned that the past, though it could never be erased, did not have to define the future, that forgiveness, reconciliation, and redemption were always possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, glorious ray of light across the water, Katerina smiled. She had lived a full life, a life of love, of loss, of struggle, of triumph. She had faced her demons, had overcome her challenges, had found her own way. She was at peace. She was free. She was home. The air was filled with the scent of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, a gentle lullaby, a peaceful serenade to a life well lived, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit.